So this class is for someone who has, for the first time, has just started learning JavaScript for a few months, usually 2 to 6 months. Maybe you completed an online tutorial like Code Academy, Code School, Khan Academy, something like that. You want to continue solidifying your fundamentals, you're looking for more practice, or you're trying to get into Hack Reactor. So I initially created this class to help you prepare for the Hack Reactor interview. It's a 2-part class, and this is the second part. So the first part, which I taught yesterday and will be also released on Front End Masters, just reviews the core foundations of JavaScript. We talked about objects, arrays, and functions. Those are some of the most important aspects of the language, as well as the most confusing for beginners. And then today we're gonna build on that, and we're gonna explore even more into functions and get started with some functional programming with the underscore library. And the hope for this class is once you have the strong foundation, you can go out and be an even stronger JavaScript engineer. Cool. And so I'm just going to jump right into review because we have a lot to cover today, and we only have like 7 hours. So here we go. So here's a chart from yesterday. We have the anatomy of a function. So what is the declaration or the definition of the function from yesterday? Joe?
It's the actual commands that get executed as part of the function.
Yeah, so the function declaration is starts with a keyword function, and it follows through to the bracket. So it contains the function, it contains the keyword function, the parameters, and the function body. And what about the function name? And note that the function name here is being used loosely to mean any way that we can refer to the function later in our code. So that could be the actual function name, it could be a variable where the function is stored. So we have the function name, this is an add function. So we have yellow add here, that's a function name, and we refer to it down here as well. And then we have the parameters. The parameters are placeholders or variables. They're like variables in that they don't have a value until they're assigned a value. And the way that we assign parameters a value is by passing them arguments. And so here are arguments down here. We pass the arguments at call time or when we invoke the function. When we invoke the function is when we pass the arguments, and at that point is when our parameters gain a value. Before that, our parameters are undefined. And then the other important thing is the function body. So the function body is never run until we call the function. So the function body is in between these two parentheses here, and that code, that return a plus b, is never run until down here. So if we were to pretend that we were in the interpreter, we'd start here above this add function. We'd say, okay, great, we're going to create a variable and store this function definition in that variable in memory, and then it's going to skip the entire function body, so that return a plus b is never run. And then once we get to the add function, it says, oh, this variable add, oh yeah, it's a function. Then we're going to call it, and we're going to pass these arguments here, 3, 4, and 5. Then at that point only does it go into the function body and run the containing code. So we invoked it down here, then we skip back up, and then it goes into this statement, which is return a plus b. And also at that point is when we give value to our parameters. So at this point is when a and b now contain the values 3 and 4. So that was a review. Do we have any questions on sort of the anatomy of the function, the vocab words? So thumbs? So and those of you joining online, thumbs, a thumb up is a B, and a thumb down is a P, and then a middle thumb is just a dash. And so we use the thumbs to sort of gauge where everyone's at in the room, and we're trying to be honest with each other about where we are so that I can go slower or faster based on how the collective. And then it also just gives me feedback on if I explain something thoroughly enough, if I should explain something a different way. So it's really important to really be honest when we do our thumbs. Cool. Lots of thumbs up down there. Cool. So the slides link where it says /live, that is the live slideshow. So you can tune in there, or you could just go through the slides yourself. So the first thing we're just gonna jump right into scope. What is scope? How many people here have heard of scope? I've heard of scope. Never heard of scope. What is scope then? How about Andy? What is scope?
I'd say scope is, from what I understand, a set of rules where it defines where variables are stored, I guess.
Yeah, so it defines where we can access variables, where variables kind of live or exist. Cool. What about Rich?
Yeah, I look at it as like an area where a variable or something is relevant, and outside of that scope, that variable or element may not even exist, or so
Yeah,
it's like
absolutely.
a hierarchy of maybe spaces, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So in essence, scope is where our variables have meaning. So if we try to access a variable outside of its scope, that variable won't exist and will throw an error. And the important thing about scope is created dynamically whenever we call the function. So we think about scope a lot of times as being in the function body itself. And you can think of, you can sort of think of these two brackets here that define the function body as a representation of scope. However, the scope itself isn't created until we call that function here. So every time we call a function, we create a new scope. So if we call this add function 3 times, we then have 3 scopes created. And that's why we can have different values in the function body. Using the same function, have different values for our parameters, for example, or anything. You have a question?
I have a question. Other structures besides functions but have curly brackets like
like blocks.
Whiles and fors, do they create their own scope?
Not in JavaScript.
Only functions.
Only functions. So we have this thing called local scope, and this is how we create a scope in JavaScript, is by wrapping in a function. And this is the only way that we can create a scope, is by saying var name inside of a function body. So if, for example, we console log local out here, this would be outside of that scope, and that would give us an error because there's no local variable there. And this is also, oh, do you have a question?
The question is, if you declare a named variable as the function versus a function in the name, is it the
what's
same
the
thing?
difference?
Yeah.
It's basically the same thing. So the question is, what's the difference between naming a function like this or like this? The difference is that this function name here is going to be hoisted to the top of the scope, and that you can refer to this function, the whole function body, everything. It'll be hoisted to the top. Whereas if you store it in a variable, it will follow variable hoisting rules. We're not really going to get into hoisting today. It's kind of like a, I don't know. It's something that happens in JavaScript. That's sort of like extra points if you know it. But if you just follow the general rules, you shouldn't have to worry about it. But in general, I would recommend to store it in a function. I'm sorry, store it in a variable rather than just creating a named function.
If you take the var off of that second line, then will the console log work?
That's my next slide. So good, you're a step ahead.
All right.
No worries. So this is a private variable, and local is in the local scope. And then we have something also called global scope. So global variables can be accessed anywhere in your application. This could be dangerous if you have naming collisions. You might not know which one wins, and you can have unexpected results. So in general, you want to avoid putting things in the global scope. So one way to create something in the global scope is to simply, outside of a function, say var x equals global. Or even if it's inside of a function, what you could do is you could leave the var off. This would still work. It just automatically makes that variable part of the global scope. So make sure that you do have those vars.
Now the indentation there is not relevant in JavaScript?
No, white space doesn't matter.
Okay.
And another thing that's kind of a hack is that you could put it on the window object. So all global variables are located on the window object. So you could say window.y, or at least in the browser. So in browser land, every global variable is attached to the window object. So this wouldn't be true in different other environments like Node, or if you're programming like a Tessel or something. The environment depends on this, but in the browser window is where all of our globals live.
So that Z equals global here tool, that's global because you didn't use the var?
Yes. Any other questions?
And I could access X or Z with window.x or Z later on if I want.
Yes. Yeah. So we're talking about how to make privacy or make local variables in our functions. But what if we have a function nested inside of another function? How does that affect our scope? What do we need to know about that to effectively handle our functions? So we have here, just a review, is we have this blender function. And here, see, this is a name function. This isn't one that's being stored in a var. So we have a blender function. It takes fruit, and it assigns that fruit to B. And then it blends smoothie. BS means blend smoothie. And it's going to alert the fruit, whatever you pass into it, plus yogurt makes a fruit swirl. And then we call it here, and then we call it down here. And the question is, what if where can we access these variables in these nested scope? So the parent has no access to the child scope. So if we said var, I don't know, x equals ASDF, sorry, my creative juices are a little slow this morning. We couldn't say down here, we couldn't console.log x. That's because while child scopes are nested, the inner nested function has access to the parent scope as well as the global scope, but the parents don't have access to the child scope. And at Hack Reactor, we use this metaphor for functions that I mentioned yesterday, where a function is like a blender. A blender is an object. We can move it around. I can hand it to different people, and we can save it in a variable if we wanted to. But to run the function or to turn on the blender, you have to put in the fruit and then press the button, right? And so call time is pressing the button, for example. And so the extension of that metaphor as it applies to scope, it's a little gruesome, but you never want to put your hand inside the blender. So if you kind of forget which way, who can access what, if it's the parent or the child, just remember you can't put your hand inside of a blender, or you don't want to put your hand inside of a blender. And that will help you remember that the parent can't reach into the child scope, but the child can actually reach into the parent scope. So that's why here in this alert, we can access the variables in the parent scope here, y and b, but we can't console.log x down here at the bottom.
I guess I'm confused with the analogy. How can why would you want a child reaching into a blender?
You don't want children reaching into blenders. That's not what I'm trying to promote. You don't, so we have a nested function here. You see that we have this blend smoothie function, and then we have the blender function, right? So we have this function inside of the function. And the question is, at which scope? So we have two different scopes that we're talking about. We have the parent scope, and then we have the child scope. And we're trying to figure out which scopes have access to which variables. So the child one, the inner function, has access to the parent scope and the global scope, and all the way up the chain. So if it was nested many times, any parent, it has access to those variables in that scope. However, the parent cannot access the child scope. So this outer scope here can't access this inner scope. And that's why this console.log x would throw an error. Does that make sense? Cool.
Somebody in chat was just asking, I think, of why you were calling the BS function there rather than returning.
Rather than returning it?
Yeah.
Just because we're just calling it. I mean, there's no reason. We could return it, but then that adds an extra step of having to call it later. And we're not returning anything from this function at all. We're just alerting. So we could play with this function if we wanted to. So I don't know if you can read that, but it says blueberry and yogurt makes a blueberry swirl. And so we just created a scope here. So when we called this blender function, we created this scope that you can kind of represent by these brackets. We created a scope there. And then here, when we called this blend smoothie function, BS is like terrible naming. I didn't think about that ahead of time. When we called the blend smoothie function, we create a second scope here. So this inner scope has access to the parent scope, and that's why B and Y, they know what values they hold because the child scope accesses the parent.
If you move the BS invocation down 2 lines, will that work?
No. And the reason, so the question was, if we move this BS call time down here, would it work? And the answer is no, because the function BS is actually local to the blender function. And so just like we couldn't console.log local up here, because it's private, we can't console log. We can't access the BS here.
Same. So and the other thing is there's no arguments being passed to BS, but it's still rendering the blueberry and the yogurt because
it has access to the parent scope.
A follow-up on the moving the invocation. If you moved it down 2 lines, could you say blender.bs?
No. No.
But if you name it that way, wouldn't it hoist it up?
It would hoist it to the top of the scope. So it would be it would be like equivalent to just like, so how the hoisting would work is it would be equivalent of just like putting it up at the very top. So we could technically, call it up here. This is like not something I want to cover too in depth because it's a little bit confusing. But the way that this function works is it's hoisted so that you could actually call the function up here. Yep.
Question about the variable x. If it was declared with the var keyword, would it be in the global scope or just the scope above it?
Good question. So if we do it like that, we take off the var, then that would be in the global scope. So it would be the equivalent of being in this scope up here.